Hey guys, Brian from Brian Boas here. Boas are one of the easiest types of pet reptile to get to feed. However, there are some that do test my patience. Today I'm going to go over some of the most annoying feeding related behaviors I've seen in my collection of boas, as well as discuss some of the ways that I use to deal with them. So first of all, what I'm going to show today are the exceptions to the rule. In general, boas are really easy to get to feed. They're not like ball pythons and some other species that just go off food for no apparent reason. These guys just want to eat and eat and eat, and you have to really be careful not to overfeed them. That being said, there are certain times where it's not that unusual to see boas stop feeding, and this includes during a shed cycle while they're in their opaque state, or during breeding if a female's gravid or a male is really seriously interested in breeding a female. You know, he's got his mind on other things rather than feeding. However, I have noticed that most of my boas will feed during the shed cycle. You know, maybe like, 15-20% of them don't feed during the shed cycle. And it's not every shed cycle. Maybe once in a while they might not feed during a shed cycle. And then even when my boas are breeding, they'll typically eat. The females I usually feed about once a month up until about a month or a month and a half before the due date, and typically they'll take the food. Once in a while I'll have a female that won't feed. So even when these times they sometimes don't eat, my boas will typically feed. But I have seen in a handful, I would say maybe like 4 or 5% of the animals in my collection, they have these annoying behaviors, and it's just something that I've kind of learned to deal with over time to adapt to their behavior and to maximize their feeding. And these behaviors in general, they're individual behaviors. They're not really specific to a type of boa. It's just one boa, for whatever reason, displays this annoying behavior, and other members of that same locality or even same litter mates don't show the behavior. Some of the behaviors though are more common in a certain type of boa. So with that in mind, let's get right to the countdown. And the first annoying feeding behavior is the boas that won't eat live food. And so the vast majority of boas have no problem with frozen thawed, and I do feed frozen thaws to 99% of my boas all the time. When my baby boas are born, typically I'll feed them a live meal for the first 3 or 4 feedings, and then I get them onto the onto the frozen thawed rodents from the live. In some cases, some animals are a little stubborn, and it might be like 6 months to, up to a year or so before they'll take the frozen thawed. And this is, I've seen it most commonly with my island boas like the Crawl Key and the Hog Island. But I do have a few adults, including this one, that for whatever reason they still want to insist on eating live food even if they're several years old. And this is a 2018 holdback Honduran Firebelly Boa, and for whatever reason she doesn't want to eat frozen thawed. And I have 2 holdbacks from the same litter that they're fine with eating frozen thawed, and they always eat no problem. This female will just refuse the frozen thawed, and she has made some improvements lately where she's eaten frozen thawed, but for the first few years I was having to feed her a live jumbo mouse. And her growth may have been stunted a bit because a mouse is not that big of a meal, and so she probably didn't take in as much food as her litter mates. So even though she is showing some interest in frozen thawed prey items, she's actually displaying annoying feeding behavior number 2, and that's boas that either constrict a live meal and then they don't eat it, or they will accept a frozen thawed meal, but then they constrict it and then they release it and won't eat it for whatever reason. And she's been showing that lately. The second annoying feeding behavior I see a lot in my baby boas when I'm transitioning them onto frozen thawed. Like many of the island boas, after eating their first meals being live, I get the frozen thawed and I dangle it in front of them, and typically they'll constrict but then they'll release, and then I have to go back into the enclosure, pick up the item with tweezers, dangle it again, they constrict again, but then they release. And sometimes this continues for like 3 or 4 cycles, so it gets kind of annoying. Usually they'll eventually end up swallowing the prey item. But I've seen that some animals are retaining this into their subadult stage. In addition to the Honduran Firebelly we just looked at, this is a Hog Island female from 2019. And she does the same thing. She will accept a frozen thawed item and constrict around it, but then she invariably releases it. And so this will typically continue for several rounds. Sometimes, at that point the prey item is so mangled and starting to decompose I have to throw it away. Sometimes I just cave and give her a live prey item. Sometimes she actually will eat it. But what is similar with the Honduran Firebelly, this female, I have 2 littermate holdbacks and they eat frozen thawed fine, but for whatever reason this particular female just doesn't want to. It almost makes me think that this is some kind of almost like a developmental delay in these animals. They just retain behavior that's more associated with neonate boas. And hopefully they'll outgrow this behavior at some point, because it really gets annoying having to spend so much time to get these animals to take the food. The first 2 annoying feeding behaviors we explored have to do with reluctance to feed, but the next one has to do with overzealousness, and that is when animals do what I call obliteration, and I call these animals obliterators. So basically they want to hit the prey item with overwhelming force just to ensure that it's got 0 chance of ever making it out alive. And I've seen this a lot with my true red tails, and one guy in particular that does this is this Guyana true redtail boa. And so this guy, you can probably tell, is just rippling with muscles. He's super strong and powerful. And actually I got him, he's in breeding trials right now. I thought I'd give him a couple minutes break from breeding. Hopefully we'll have some babies this year. But this guy, when I give a prey item, he just hits it with all of his might. And of course I just feed him frozen thawed prey items, which is probably good for the sake of the prey items. But he wants to just make sure that these animals are just going to be overwhelmed with force. And so incidentally, the female, who's actually about 1.5 feet bigger, one of my biggest boas in the collection, displays this behavior too. And I was at the receiving end of it one time when I made the mistake of leaving the hinge door open, and she was in a pissy mood, and I walked past and she hit me full force in the hand. Probably one of the worst, if not the worst, snake bites I've ever received. It was like getting punched with an open mouth boa, and it left the usual little pinpricks, about 3 dozen little pinpricks from the teeth, but it also left a big bruise, big black and blue, just from the force. And it actually hurt more from the force than from the teeth or the loss of blood. So I'm super careful around this female. From now on I haven't had any incidents with her. But these obliterators, they just want to hit that prey item with all their might, make sure that it's got no chance of making it out of there. The next annoying feeding behavior is kind of the opposite of the overzealous feeder, and that's what I call the slow eater. And I actually have a Coup's Pastel Colombian male that shows this behavior, and I've seen it in a few other boas. But basically what they do is you hold out the prey item with your tongs or your tweezers or whatever, and the animal slowly goes up to it and then kind of sniffs it deliberately with his tongue, and then just slowly opens the mouth and bites onto it. And it's almost like it's in slow motion. It looks like these particular animals have no rush whatsoever to eat the prey item. They just want to kind of go up and hold on to it. Sometimes they'll actually hold it in their mouth for 10, 20, 30 minutes. Maybe they're just savoring the experience and enjoying the rodent flavors or whatever, like a fine meal. But usually they end up eating it. It can be a little annoying because you want to see your snake eat, and it's annoying when it's just kind of half-assedly holding on to it like that. But usually they end up eating. Actually, I have another female Hog Island Boa that does this a lot too. And these animals, they always eat. They just are kind of slow and deliberate doing it. Just a different kind of behavior that I've seen in some of my boas. The annoying boa feeding behaviors we've looked at so far haven't really been specific to a type of boa. They've more been an individual type of behavior. But the next behavior is really specific to one locality of boa, and that's the Pearl Island or sabogae boa, like this male. And these guys are typically super enthusiastic feeders. They're enjoyable to feed, no issues with them not eating or anything like that. But they have one habit that they basically launch themselves out of the cage. And if you're not used to this, it can be a little disconcerting because they can basically propel themselves about half of their body length straight out at the food item. And you know, I've gotten whizzed past my face a few times when I first got these animals, and I quickly adapted, and usually I'll give them food with a pair of grippers held well away from my body. But it's almost like they're rockets, kind of like that song Rocket Man. This guy is the Rocket Man. He just launches himself out to try to get the food. And these animals, they do have a reputation for being aggressive. Mine are really not aggressive. You can see this guy is pretty mellow. They do move around a lot, but they're a really cool, underrated boa. And I think these guys could take off in popularity. Right now, they're just, I think people overlook them because, you know, they're different. They're kind of longer than most boas. They're kind of more elongated and adapted to life in the trees. And people think, well, they can't really handle them because they want to take off more. But it's definitely a cool boa to have in your collection just because of the diversity of behaviors, that they don't want to sit still nearly as much. But, you know, if you're not used to this launching, feeding behavior, these guys can take a little bit of getting used to, but kind of a cool thing to watch out for in your sabogae boa. The next annoying feeding behavior is really pretty common, and I've seen it from time to time in probably almost about half of my boas, and that's when a boa strikes out against the front of the cage in anticipation of food. So you'll walk into your snake room and you're ready to get feeding, and you've got this rodents on the tongs or forceps or ripper, and you're going cage to cage offering the prey items. And the animals that are waiting, they're really anticipating that delicious rodent, and they can smell the delicious smell in the air. So in anticipation, they strike out against the front of the cage. And so I've seen this the most with plastic type snake cages. It's a lot less common with rack systems. Like these big tubs behind me, I never see my animals doing this, but I've seen it quite a bit with my plastic snake cages. And this is why, in general, I prefer, you know, having a tub setting as long as the animal is small enough to keep in that particular rack system. It just seems to be much less stressful for the animals and much less likely that they're going to have this kind of abnormal behavior. But typically they'll strike out against the front of the cage. Usually it's not a big deal. They don't injure themselves, but they can. And I've heard stories about boas breaking their jaws because they hit the front of the cage with such force. And this can lead to, you know, if they get an injury in their mouth, it can lead to stomatitis or mouth rot, which can end up with the death of the boa. So it's really not something that you want to take lightly. So what I would advise is, if you do have a snake that's doing this in a plastic snake cage, you might want to cover the front of the cage with some dark paper or, you know, some kind of a opaque surface, just so that he doesn't see and strike out against the front. And you also want to, when you're offering the food, you don't want to leave the animal waiting. You want to give him or her the food really quickly, so the animal is less likely to do that. And of course, you want to be super careful when you go in there to feed the animal. You never ever want to handle or offer the animal food with your bare hands. You know, I see this all the time on YouTube videos. It's just a really idiotic thing to do, holding a prey item with your hand in front of a snake. You should always use a grabber or forceps or some kind of tool to put safety between the snake's mouth and your hand. But anyway, you know, if you do that with your snake that strikes out against the front of the cage, hopefully you can mitigate any potential damage. Another kind of annoying feeding related behavior is when a snake or a boa eats the prey upside down. So occasionally they won't eat head first. They'll actually go to the butt of the prey item and they'll eat against the grain of the fur, which is a lot harder to get down the gullet of the snake than eating head first. And so I've seen sometimes snakes will struggle to eat this, and people have asked me about this and if they should be concerned that their snake is going to choke because they can't get the item down because the legs are, you know, kind of poking out the wrong way. In general, it's not a big deal. It might just take the snake a little bit longer to eat the prey item, but your boa or other snake is still going to be able to eat the prey item the wrong way, assuming that it's not too big of a prey item. It's just going to end up taking them a little longer and maybe be a little bit annoying to the keeper, but nothing to worry about that much. And in general, I've only seen this a few times, and boas typically don't repeat this behavior. They might do it once, but then I've never seen it again. I have one final annoying boa feeding related behavior and one final boa to leave you guys with. And this is a behavior I really haven't seen all that too much, but it's actually pretty comical when you see it. And it's when a boa is so enthusiastic about the feeding that he or she ends up biting herself or himself rather than biting the prey item. And I actually saw that in this Argentine boa not that long ago. And this animal, this is the only time I've seen this behavior. For whatever reason, it detected the rodent, got really excited, and then actually constricted the rodent while biting itself. I guess, her aim isn't that good, and she couldn't differentiate, for whatever reason, her own body from the prey item. And so obviously you don't want a snake biting itself, and you don't want it to do any damage to itself, but typically they really don't do that much damage, if any damage at all. I saw no teeth marks or anything in this boa after she let go, and even if there was something, it would probably go away with a shed or two, so not something to really be all that worried about. However, it kind of underscores the fact that it's really a bad idea to ever have more than one boa in a cage, because if they can't tell their own body from the food, there's no way they're going to be able to tell the body of another snake from the food. So, if you made the mistake of feeding two boas at once, it probably would be disastrous, and there's a good chance that one boa could end up eating the other boa just because it thought it was food, and it probably would end up dying in the process because it would be eating an item that would be way too large. So it's a definite no-no to ever try to feed two boas in the same enclosure. Definite no-no. So anyway, I hope this was enjoyable. And the point of this whole video is that every boa is different, and we really have to look at our boa's individual behaviors. You can read all about boas as a whole in all of the great books and websites that are out there, but you really have to know your own individual boas and their individual behavioral idiosyncrasies so that you can adapt the husbandry and the care as best to that individual boa. And the only way to do this is to just keep a lot of boas, spend a lot of time with them, study them, and try new things in order to deal with any kind of issues that might present themselves. So these boas aren't bad. They just behave in different ways for whatever reason, and like I said, every boa is individual. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you have experienced any other types of feeding challenges, I'd love to hear in the comments. Also, ways that you've dealt with it. It's always helpful for the Bryan Boas community to learn from your experiences. So I really appreciate if you would write them below. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.